This video provides a short explanation of key terminology and concepts related to natural assets, ecosystem functions, and ecosystem services. When we speak about natural assets, what we're referring to is those elements of the natural environment that people value for their contributions to social and economic well-being. So things like forests, water bodies, mineral reserves, fertile land, air, and biodiversity, among others. We sometimes use the term natural capital because it conveys this notion of a stock of a scarce and productive resource that's providing a flow of important goods and services. And we can refer to these goods and services flowing from natural assets as ecosystem goods and services, or simply as ecosystem services. In addition to the ecosystem services themselves, we're also interested in the biological and geochemical and physical processes that are taking place within ecosystems to produce those services. So we refer to those as ecosystem functions. And you can see on the diagram on the left then provides a conceptual illustration of how ecosystem functions that are occurring within natural assets produce a flow of ecosystem services that are of value to people. The diagram also highlights that our economic practices and management responses impact the extent and condition of ecosystems and thereby affect the performance of the ecosystem functions that are occurring within them. Ecosystem functions are commonly grouped into different categories relating to the processes that are occurring and the services that are flowing to people. So provisioning functions relate to photosynthesis, nutrient cycling, water cycling, and other things that lead to, for instance, the creation of plant biomass and other provisioning services when used by humans. Regulating functions include climate regulation through carbon sequestration, water purification through biogeochemical processes, and disease control through predator-prey dynamics. Supporting functions maintain and enhance biodiversity and allow ecosystems to sustain themselves. For example, nutrient cycling and soil formation of the provision of habitat. Finally, cultural functions provide aesthetic, spiritual, educational, and recreational opportunities and values. In the project, we use 19 different ecosystem functions that you can see here in this diagram, and those produce then 28 different ecosystem services. So it's a slightly different view of environmental management compared to a more traditional habitat conservation perspective. In this case, we're looking, instead of the assets themselves, for instance, trees, we're looking at the functions that are occurring within ecosystems and the services that are flowing more broadly. And so it's important to note then that, the same service may be deriving from multiple different functions occurring in a bunch of different types of ecosystems. It also relates to policy context. For instance, in Queensland, where the project is based, the Planning Act of Queensland in 2016, the intended outcome of that act is the achievement of ecological sustainability. But importantly, that is through a balance that includes protecting ecological processes and natural systems. You can see here further defined as conserving, enhancing, or restoring the life-supporting capacities of air, ecosystems, soil, and water for present and future generations. So that very much, in our mind, is a reference to ecosystem functions and preserving and acting with the intention of maintaining those ecosystem functions. But similarly, if we look at the Shaping SEQ, which is the statutory regional plan that gives effect to that Planning Act, we can see other things like Goal 4 here, Goal 4, Element 7, to protect areas that supply high levels of ecosystem services from inappropriate development and other irreversible impacts. So in this case, we can refer then to services rather than the functions. So closely related, but a different lens that we can apply then to conservation and environmental management. In terms of actual protection and management, it is somewhat complex because unlike forests, which are relatively stable and stay in one place, ecosystem functions have these direct and indirect flows. So for instance, within a boundary, for example, a farmer's field, we can have these in situ benefits provided, for instance, by the soil formation that's happening there and the productive, generation of productive and fertile land for growing crops. But in other instances, if we look out across a vast landscape, we have more line of sight types of ecosystem services. Or if we think about carbon sequestration, what is occurring in one location is actually providing benefit to people all around the world. So in other instances, we might have, a vegetation barrier that's providing protection from land that's adjacent to it, or a pollination service that's happening from land that's co-located next to a farm, and so on. So these ecosystem services are complex and flow in different ways and to different beneficiaries, both directly and indirectly. In closing, it's worth emphasizing that these relationships between natural assets, the ecological functions occurring within them, and the ecosystem services that benefit people are complex, dynamic, and fragile. A key takeaway is that although protecting biodiverse, rich wilderness areas is, of course, of critical importance, many important ecosystem functions are taking place on farmlands and forests and playgrounds and streetscapes and shorelines and backyard gardens.